Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Tonight we're returning to another one of your favorites, Cassell's Book of Birds, from the text of Dr. Brehm and Thomas Rymer Jones, FRS, Professor of Natural History and Comparative Anatomy in King's College, London, with upwards of 400 engravings and a series of colored plates. Written in 4 volumes. Volume 1. Published by Cassell, Petter and Gulpin, London and New York. Let's pick up where we left off, midway through the editor's introduction. In taking, therefore, a brief survey of the principal groups or orders under which the feathered races have been distributed, we will begin with those appointed to live on trees, inasmuch as these are regarded by the author of the following pages as being entitled to the highest rank in the class to which they belong, rivaling in intelligence, as some of them do, the apes and monkeys, of which they are in general the inseparable companions. Few people in this country have any adequate conception of a tropical forest, and consequently are scarcely prepared to see whole races of animals constructed specially for a residence in the umbrageous wilderness within its pathless precincts. The great forest of the Amazon, in all its primeval grandeur, stretches for 1,000 miles from north to south, and probably 300 or 400 from east to west. And over all this vast extent of territory, so closely are the branches interwoven that, as we are told, a monkey might make his way, passing from tree to tree, without ever coming to the ground, except at those points where the rivers hold their course through the tangled yet sublime scenery. In these untrodden vastnesses, the trees, rising frequently to a height of 60 or 80 feet, with stems perfectly straight and without a branch, give support to the huge creepers that climb around their trunks like immense serpents waiting for their prey, or sometimes stretching obliquely from their summits like the stays of a lofty mast, here twisting round each other till they form living cables, as if to bind securely the patriarchs of the forest, there wreathed in tangled festoons, and themselves covered with smaller creepers and parasitic plants. Such is Mr. Wallace's description of the interior of the Amazonian forest. The forests of Rio Janeiro, say Mr. Darwin, are ornamented with the cabbage palm trees 110 feet high, with a stem so narrow that it might be clasped with 2 hands. The woody creepers themselves are of great thickness, some of them measuring 2 feet in circumference. If the eye was turned from the world of foliage above to the ground beneath, It was attracted by the extreme elegance of the leaves of the ferns and mimosae, or sensitive plants. The latter in some parts covered the ground. In walking across these thick beds, a broad track was marked by the change of color produced by the drooping of their sensitive leaves. It is easy to specify the individual objects of admiration in these grand scenes, but it is not possible to give an adequate idea of the higher feelings of wonder, astonishment, and devotion which fill and elevate the mind. These are the localities amongst which species of the arboreal orders find their paradise and hold undisturbed possession. Myriads of climbing birds, parrots, macaws, and cockatoos fill the whole atmosphere with joyful screams, deafening the very monkeys with their din. Gorgeous toucans with enormous bills and feathers dipped in flame, and woodpeckers scarcely less gaily clad, make the woods echo, as with axe-like beaks they chop their way in search of insect food. The peculiar structure of the feet in the arboreal races is evidently adapted to a life amongst the branches of trees. The outer toe can be directed backwards like a thumb, enabling them to grasp the boughs as with a hand. If, leaving the trackless gloom of the forest, we approach the sylvan scenery of the surrounding country, the bosky woods and isolated trees, or the sparse undergrowth of bushy shrubs, we find innumerable forms that have their feet contrived for perching only. These incessorial races, called also passeres from their general resemblance to sparrows, live upon insects, fruit, and grain, but those with strong beaks live more exclusively upon grain, and those with slender beaks upon insects. The proportional length of their wings is as variable as their habits. They have 4 toes, generally so disposed that there are 3 in front and 1 behind, sometimes all 4 in front. Their legs are slender, and they hop rather than walk. The forests and the trees, the bushes and the brakes, the thickets and the hedgerows, being thus provided with appropriate denizens, we turn our attention to the level ground. And here we find species as obviously designed for a terrestrial existence as were the preceding groups for a residence among the branches. The terrestrial or gallinaceous birds live principally upon the ground. Their body is large and heavy, and their wings short and rounded, so as to be but ill adapted to prolonged flight. They have 3 toes in front, which are united at their base by a short fold of the skin, and their hinder toe is affixed above the level of the rest. In many species, the male is provided with formidable weapons in the shape of spurs. To this order belong the turkeys, pheasants, and barn-door fowls. Their legs are thick, strong, and muscular, their toes short and powerful. They always prefer running to flying, and indeed will rarely take to their wings except when compelled to do so by the urgency of the occasion. If any doubt could be entertained as to the terrestrial character of the Gallinaceous birds, there can be none whatever as to those distinguished by the name of cursories or runners. The principal characteristic of the cursorial race consists in the undeveloped condition of their wings, which are quite disproportioned to the size of their body. In some cases, these rudimentary wings are but imperfectly furnished with feathers, and seem only to be used after the manner of sails, to catch the wind and thus assist in running. The living species form two families, of one of which the ostrich, and of the other the Patriarchs, is the type. Leaving the firm, dry land, we next turn our attention to the marshes, the dubious confines between land and water, and here we find the order of waders, or, as they have been named on account of their long, stilt-like legs, gralatores, or stilt-walkers. These birds, as their name imports, are characterized by the height of their legs, which are naked, and thus adapted for wading to a certain depth into the water, where many species catch their prey. A remarkable example is met with in this order of the facility with which difficulties, apparently insurmountable, in the adaptation of certain species to peculiar circumstances, have been encountered and overcome. In India, the tanks and ponds of considerable depth are more or less covered with the broad leaves of water lilies and other floating vegetation. In such places, which are far too deep to be occupied by wading birds, and yet too extensive to be left without inhabitants, we find a family provided with toes so enormously lengthened, and moreover eked out by claws of such extraordinary length, that the spread of their feet extends over a very large surface, thus enabling them to walk over the floating weeds. Another order of birds comprehends those whose feet are specially constructed for swimming, constituting a natatorial type. For this purpose they are placed far back upon the body. The legs are short and compressed, and the toes are united by a web. Their plumage is thick and shining, impregnated with oil and closely packed with soft down, so as to preserve them from all contact with the water. They are the only birds the length of whose neck much surpasses that of their legs, thus enabling them, while swimming at the surface, to obtain their food at the bottom. Such are the ducks and swans, which are, moreover, further characterized by having their bill covered with a soft skin and furnished occasionally at the sides with ridges and tooth-like points. The divers, trusting to their superior powers of battling with the watery element, are met with further from the shore, while at distances still more remote from land, daring the utmost fury of the tempestuous ocean, walking upon the waters or riding upon the seas, up and down, from the base of the wave to the billow's crown, in the midst of the flashing and feathery foam, the stormy petrel finds her home. Lastly, in this our rapid survey of the distribution of the feathered tribes, we have to speak of those whose element is the air. And here, perhaps, the reader may feel inclined to remark that, with the exception of the cursorial birds, all the species we have had occasion to mention are more or less capable of flight, that this is the special attribute of the whole class. Nevertheless, upon a little consideration, he will find that amongst the many races that fly well, there are some so preeminent in this respect that all others quail before them. It is one thing to be able to fly, and another to be furnished with wings so powerful that they never seem to tire. It is one thing to be the champion of the coppice, but another to be the tyrant of the sky. The greatest powers of flight are of course conferred upon the rapacious birds, whose business is to overtake and destroy their swift flying prey. To enable them to do this, their wings are necessarily of the most perfect structure, and they may also be recognized by their feet, which are strong and armed with formidable talons. Of the swiftness of the falcon we have spoken elsewhere, and anyone who has witnessed the flight of the eagle is not likely to have forgotten so grand a spectacle. His movements are majestic, and as he sails above the clouds on outstretched wings, he seems to feel himself the monarch of the scene around. And yet even the falcon and the eagle cannot, as regard their powers of flight, be looked upon as the most highly gifted of flying birds. The spread of wing of the frigate birds measures 10 feet from tip to tip, and their flight is so powerful that they are everywhere to be seen in tropical climates at immense distances from land, while the albatross has been known to fly around a ship for weeks together, exhibiting such indomitable strength of wing that it has been supposed to be capable of circling round the world. It is by no means our intention to trouble the reader with unnecessary details concerning the anatomy of the creatures upon the history of which he is about to enter. Nevertheless, it is indispensably requisite that we should give at least an outline of their internal organization. No one can have examined attentively the bony framework whereby the body of a bird is sustained without being forcibly impressed with the lightness as well as the compactness of its construction. The most wonderful economy is exhibited in the arrangement of the weighty material of which it consists. The bones present in their interior extensive cavities, whereby they are considerably lightened, and their walls, although exceedingly dense and strong, are much thinner than in any other animals. The extremities of the cylindrical bones are occupied by a light open network of slender filaments, shooting across in every direction from wall to wall. And as these attenuated buttresses are likewise hollow, it is easy to perceive how incomparably lightness and strength are here conjoined. The extent to which the skeleton is thus filled with air varies in different birds in relation with their powers of flight. In the swifts and the hummingbirds, every bone of the skeleton, even to the toes and the claws, is permeated by the atmospheric fluid. In the opposite extreme, the terrestrial apteryx and the aquatic penguin have not a single bone thus excavated. The skeleton of an animal formed for flight must be constructed upon mechanical principles of a very refined character. The utmost likeness is indispensable. Nevertheless, in a framework which has to sustain the powerful action of muscles so vigorous, strength and firmness are equally essential. It is in combining these two opposite qualities that the human mechanician exhibits the extent of his resources and the accuracy of his knowledge. But let the best and most ingenious mechanic carefully examine the skeleton of a bird, and we doubt not that in its construction he will find all his ingenuity surpassed, and perhaps derive not a little instruction from the survey. In order to render the following account of the structure of a bird's skeleton intelligible to the non-scientific reader, we have delineated that of the pigeon, and with this figure before us, we shall have but little difficulty in indicating those points with which it is essential that the reader of the present volume should be intimately acquainted. See Figure 12. In the backbone or vertebral column, we find three principal regions, each of which will merit distinct notice. The cervical region, or that portion belonging to the neck, is exceedingly variable in its proportionate length, and forms the only flexible portion of the spine. It performs indeed the functions of an arm, at the end of which the beak, the chief instrument of prehension, is situated. The number of vertebrae entering into the composition of this part of the skeleton is very variable. In the swan there are as many as 23, in the crane 19, while in the sparrow there are only 9. As a general rule, it may be observed that the neck of a bird is never so short as not to be able to reach to every part of the body. In many aquatic species, it is remarkably elongated, whether they swim upon the surface by means of webbed or natatory feet like the swan, or wade into rivers and marshes like the crane or the heron. Throughout the entire class, a very beautiful contrivance is observable in the S-shaped curvature of this region, the joints of the upper vertebra being so disposed that they will bend forwards, while in the lower part they can only be bent backwards, thus enabling the bird to lengthen or shorten its neck with the utmost facility and gracefulness. But if flexibility is thus admirably provided for in the cervical region, in the thoracic portion of the skeleton, which has to support the framework of the wings and sustain the efforts of the powerful muscles connected with flight, firmness and rigidity become essential requisites. And accordingly, in the dorsal region, every means has been employed to prevent those movements which in the neck are so advantageously permitted. The vertebrae of this region are therefore so consolidated as to be almost immovable, and moreover, splints of bone laid along the back materially add to its stability and strength. There are likewise two sets of ribs, one firmly lashed to the backbone, the other strongly attached to the sides of the sternum. These dorsal and sternal ribs are moreover united to each other by firm connections, and a thorax is thus formed, possessing sufficient mobility to perform the movements connected with respiration, but still affording a strong basis for muscular action. Nay, still further to strengthen this part of the skeleton, from the hinder margin of each dorsal rib, a broad, flat plate of bone is prolonged backwards, so as to overlap the rib next behind, and thus bind the whole together as firmly as possible. The sternum or breastbone is developed in proportion to the size of the three pectoral muscles subservient to flight, and is prolonged beneath into a deep keel-like projection. In the cursorial races, such as the ostriches and the apteryx, whose wings are not available for flying, the keel is entirely wanting. Whoever considers the position of the hip joint in the skeleton of a bird, and reflects how far it is necessarily removed behind the center of gravity when the bird walks with its body in a horizontal position, will at once perceive that the hinder portion of the spinal column, having to support the whole weight of the body under the most disadvantageous circumstances, and at the same time to give attachment to the strong and massive muscles that wield the thigh, must be consolidated and strengthened in every possible manner, and that even the slight degree of movement permitted in the region of the back would here be inadmissible. Most of the hinder vertebrae are, therefore, solidly conjoined into a single piece, sufficiently strong and massive to bear the great strain to which it is continually subjected, leaving only a few of the hindmost pieces free, upon which the feathers of the tail are supported. The forelimb of a bird, although used for the purpose of flight, when stripped of the feathers and quills that, as we have already seen, form the extensive surface of the wing, will be found very much to resemble the human arm in its general arrangement, presenting only such modifications as are required for the performance of its peculiar function. The framework of the shoulder consists of three bones, named respectively the scapula or shoulder blade, the clavicle or collarbone, and the coracoid bone. The scapula is a long and comparatively slender piece placed upon the ribs and embedded in the muscles to which it gives attachment. The coracoid bone is the strongest piece of the shoulder. It supports the wing at one extremity, while at the opposite it is firmly united to the sternum by a broad and massive joint. But the most peculiarly formed part of the shoulder is the furculum, or merry thought, as it is usually called, consisting of the two collarbones united so as to form but a single fork-shaped apparatus, the presence of which materially enlarges and strengthens the shoulder without unnecessarily adding to the weight. It is by the union of the three last mentioned bones that a place is made for the socket of the shoulder, with which the wing is more immediately connected. The skeleton of the wing presents the bone of the arm, called the humerus, and the two bones of the forearm, named respectively the radius and the ulna or cubit. The wrist or carpus consists of two bones, and the metacarpus is likewise made up of two pieces. These, with two or sometimes three rudimental fingers, complete the framework of the wing. The largest finger consists of two or sometimes of three joints. A second offers but a single joint, and the third, when present, is a mere appendage to the carpus, representing a sort of apology for a thumb. The bones of the leg likewise exhibit the same parts as exist in the human skeleton, but modified. The thigh or femur is a short and strong bone, to which succeeds the leg, consisting of two bones, named the tibia and the fibula, but the latter is generally very imperfectly developed. That part which is commonly considered to be the leg consists of the bones of the ankle and a part of the foot, the tarsal and metatarsal bones consolidated into a single piece, called by anatomists the tarso-metatarsal bone, but known to ornithologists as the tarsus. At the lower extremity of the tarsus are three joints that support the three front toes, while a fourth toe, technically called the hallux, which is directed backwards, is attached to it by the intervention of a small accessory piece. In the Gallinaceous order, there exists a bony spur considered by some as representing a fifth toe. In order to facilitate the description of a bird, it is usual for the ornithologist to consider its exterior as being mapped out into sundry regions, to each of which has been assigned a definite and appropriate name. With the names of these regions and their precise application, it is requisite that the reader should be intimately acquainted. A bird, like any other vertebrate animal, is divisible into the head, the body, and the limbs, under one or other of which divisions all subordinate parts may be classed. The head consists of the skull and the bill, and is joined to the body by the neck. Commencing with the bill, we see that it is composed of two pieces, corresponding to the jaws of quadrupeds. That which is above is called the upper mandible. That which represents the under jaw is called the lower mandible. The upper mandible contains the nostrils. Its highest part is called the culmen or ridge, while the corresponding ridge of the lower mandible is called the gonus or keel. The lateral edges of the mandibles, which meet when the bill is closed, are called the margins. In some birds, the margins of the upper mandible fold over those of the lower, while in others the edges meet. When this is the case, the line of junction between the two is called the commissure. In many birds, the upper mandible is continued far back over the forehead, and there dilated, so as to form a casque or helmet. In rapacious birds and parrots, there is a belt of soft, naked skin at the base of the upper mandible, named the cere, in which the nostrils are placed, while around the eye is a space often denuded of feathers called the ophthalmic region. The head is that part which lies immediately over the skull, extending from the base of the beak to the commencement of the neck. The front or forehead is that part of the head which lies close above the nostrils. Then follows the crown or summit, which occupies the middle or center of the head, forming that part which is usually occupied by the crest in birds so ornamented. The hind head commences at the declivity of the skull. Its lower portion is called the nape. On the sides of the head, the following parts have received distinct names. The feathers that cover the ears, to save repetition, are usually called the ears. They are generally rather more rigid, and their webs more disconnected than the surrounding feathers. The space between these and the corner of the mouth, usually called the gape, is termed the cheek. The parts of the neck are thus designated. The back of the neck is called the upper neck or nucha, beneath which is the lower neck or ochinium. The underside of the neck is divided into 3 regions. First, there is the chin, or that small space just beneath the lower mandible. To the chin succeeds the upper throat, between which and the broad part of the body is the lower throat. The body represents the following regions. First, there is the breast, which extends over the space which covers the breastbone. To this succeeds the belly, which is terminated by the vent or chrism. Immediately behind the vent are the under tail covers, which are frequently of a different color from the surrounding feathers. On the upper aspect of the body, we have the interscapular region, sometimes called the back, to which succeeds the lower back, which terminates at the rump, or that part where the upper tail covers are inserted. Last of all comes the tail, composed of long, stiff feathers called the tail feathers, concerning which it is only necessary to observe that the 2 middle tail feathers are the intermedial, while those on the sides are the lateral tail feathers. The wing of a bird will be found to present a structure worthy of our highest admiration. The object aimed at in the arrangement of its different parts is evidently to obtain a very large and firm expanse of surface by employing the smallest possible quantity of material. For the purposes of flight, it is obviously necessary that the superficial extent of the wings shall be sufficiently ample, not only to sustain the weight of their possessor in the thin and yielding element in which it flies, but by the vigor of their stroke and the violence of their impulse, to propel the bird with a rapidity proportioned to the occasion, and moreover, by the lightness of their touch and the accuracy of their movements to steer and steady its course through all the varied evolutions whereby it is enabled to capture prey or sportively display the wonderful activity conferred upon the feathered tribes. We have already seen, while examining the construction of the skeleton, that the bony framework of the wing essentially resembles that of the human arm, and that the limb, when stripped of its feathers, is no more adapted for flying than our own. The needful expansion is obtained altogether by the addition of the quill feathers, which, as explained in a preceding page, combine in their structure all the qualities requisite for the intended purpose: lightness, firmness, strength, elasticity, and extent of surface. The central part of the arm or wing forms merely a basis of support into which the quills and other appendages to the wing are securely implanted. It will therefore be easily understood that the importance of the individual quills as instruments of flight will depend very much upon the position they hold in the wing, of which they form so considerable a portion, and consequently that they have received names expressive of their relative efficiency. Those that are affixed to the bones representing the hand by the length of their stroke and the peculiarity of their arrangement are obviously of primary importance, both from their size and the situation they occupy, and have consequently been named the primaries or the primary quills. They might be called with equal propriety the hand quills, a term more particularly expressive of the parts to which they are attached. Upon the relative length and other proportions of the primary quills, the shape and mechanical power of the instrument principally depend. If the first primary be the longest, the termination of the wing is sharp and pointed, or acuminate, as in most birds that are remarkable for the swiftness of their flight. Whereas if the second, third, or fourth of these quills should exceed the others in this respect, the wing becomes more and more rounded or obtuse, and the perfection of its action visibly deteriorated. The secondary quills, or secondaries, are exclusively sustained by the bones of the forearm. From their situation being much nearer to the shoulder joint than the preceding, the extent of their sweep is more limited, and their stroke much feebler. They are consequently, as their name indicates, of secondary importance in locomotion. The spurious or bastard quills are attached to the rudimental bone that represents the thumb. Their size is diminutive, and their use in flight comparatively unimportant. The wing covers, or coverts, are small feathers arranged in several rows, which overlap and strengthen the bases of the quills. They are often variously colored, and thus afford important features whereby different species may be distinguished. Besides the above, there are certain conventional terms employed by the ornithologist that will require enumeration. The arm part of the wing in the living bird is generally known as the shoulder. The elbow joint is the flexum. while that part of the forearm which corresponds to the edge of the wing is denominated the shoulder margin. The names appropriated to the different parts of the hinder limb have been already sufficiently indicated when describing the composition of the skeleton. There are many birds which have stripes of variously colored feathers situated above, before, and behind the eye, while others sometimes occur at the base of the lower mandible. To all these, distinct names have been appropriated. A superciliary stripe is situated above the eye, occupying a position analogous to that of the human eyebrow. An ordinary eye stripe is either anterior, posterior, or entire. It is called anterior when it only occupies the space between the eye and the bill, posterior when it commences behind the eye and advances towards or unites with the ear feathers, and entire when it is both posterior and anterior. A maxillary stripe commences at the base of the under mandible and descends on the sides of the neck. Such is the by no means very long list of names of parts used by the ornithologist in his description, and which in the course of the present volume will necessarily be of very frequent occurrence. The oil with which birds preen their feathers and the glands that supply it constitute a remarkable provision peculiar to the feathered creation. Embedded among the feathers at the root of the tail, there is on each side a small nipple, yielding upon pressure a butter-like substance, which the bird extracts by squeezing the orifice with his bill. By means of the oil, or rather ointment, thus procured, it dresses its feathers, either for the purpose of increasing their brilliancy, or, as in the case of the swimming birds, to make them impenetrable to wet. The pairing of birds is a feature in their history which draws a broad line of distinction between the feathered tribes and the generality of quadrupeds. Among mammiferous quadrupeds, the young derive their nutriment during the earlier period of their existence entirely from the maternal breast, the male parent contributing nothing towards its support. But in the winged races, the callow brood derive their supply of food from the industry of both parents, whose united exertions are not more than is requisite to procure the needful supply. In this circumstance, we may see a reason for the faithful love of the feathered mate as contrasted with the vagrant disposition of the quadruped. The parental fondness of birds towards their young has escaped no observer. No historian of nature is silent upon this subject. How well they caress them, says Durham, with their affectionate notes, lull and quiet them with their voice, put food into their mouths, cherish and keep them warm, teach them to peck and eat and gather food for themselves, and in a word, perform the part of so many nurses deputed by the sovereign Lord and preserver of the world to help such young and shiftless creatures. It would lead us far beyond the limits of our space were we to do more than indicate the close relationship that exists between the exalted temperature and warm clothing of the feathered creation and the wonderful instinct which urges them to build nests for the reception of their eggs, or the still more remarkable blind perseverance with which they devote themselves to the task of incubation. There is nothing, says Paley, either in the aspect or in the internal composition of an egg, which could lead even the most daring imagination to conjecture that it was hereafter to turn out from its shell a perfect living bird. From the contents of an egg, would anyone expect the production of a feathered goldfinch? To suppose the female bird to act in this process from a sagacity and reason of her own is to suppose her to arrive at conclusions there are no premises to justify. And yet he who made the egg not only ordained that such should be the result of the simple process of incubation, but, as though to confound skepticism, by giving, as it were, the last touch to his inscrutable work, provided the young bird with the means of escaping from incarceration by attaching to the end of its beak a little hammer called the bill scale, the only use of which is to crack the eggshell and allow the little prisoner to come forth. With these few prefatory remarks, we leave our author in the reader's hands, at the same time promising that he will find in the succeeding pages a rich store of valuable information. And with that, we've at last reached the end of the editor's introduction to Cassell's Book of Birds, Volume 1. As before, I learned a lot in that reading, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the diagrams, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show description. The description also includes links to ways you can support this podcast, including one-time tipping through buymeacoffee.com or becoming a subscriber on Patreon, where you'll receive exclusive episodes found nowhere else. If you'd like to connect, you can send me a message on our website, www.boringbookspod.com, or catch me on Twitter at boringbookspod. I'd love to hear from you. I'm so glad you could join me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.